Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our History Highlight series. My name is Annie Black, and I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Before we get started, just a couple of things to go over. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the program, so if you'll go ahead and locate your Q&A button, if you're on a computer, it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a tablet, you might find it at the top there. I also wanted to thank our community partners for this program, the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, Legacy Senior Communities, SMU Human Rights Program, and the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. We are happy tonight to have Dr. Sara Abosch-Jacobson back with us, our Chief Education Programs and Exhibitions Officer at the museum. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Sara.
Thank you, Annie. Good evening, everybody. I'm excited to be covering this topic with you. I'm going to share my screen and then we will get started. Here we go. And then let me. Okay. And what I want to kind of announce before I start is simply that while I am a historian, my area of specialization is not the Armenian Genocide. I actually know more about Turkish Armenian Genocide denial on the basis of the exhibit, part of our 10 Stages of Genocide exhibit that we have up in the Genocide Gallery in the museum. Denial is the final stage of genocide, and it is the stage that we use what happened in Armenia to illustrate that stage of genocide. And so this talk will be a brief history of the Armenian Genocide, and then we will talk about denial, which began during the genocide and continues to this day, so more than 100 years later. What I will do today after I've done that is open this up to question and answer. And what I promise to do, if I cannot answer specific questions about the history, is to get information and get back to you with those answers, because it used to drive me crazy when I would sit in classes when I was in high school and in college, and I would have questions and the teacher would just kind of dismiss me. And I don't want to get dismissed. I wanted answers. So as much as possible, I will get you those answers. So let's begin. I wanted to start by giving you the actual definition of genocide as enumerated or in the Genocide Convention of 1948. The Genocide Convention of 1948 was passed and approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And it's something that we highlight in our exhibit because, along with the international military tribunals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Commission is something that comes directly as an outgrowth of the horrors of the Holocaust. And so it very much is kind of within our wheelhouse as one of these developments that comes. And it's not an easy definition. And frankly, sometimes the definition surprises people if they haven't seen it before. And the reason it surprises people is because they expect it to contain a whole series of categories that we as Americans or we as people in the kind of the modern world talk about. When we talk about gender, we talk about sexuality, we talk about those kinds of identity groups, and those are not groups that are recognized under the Genocide Convention. So just to very quickly read it through to you, and I know that you can read as well, but it's important to stress this. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, that just means ethnic, racial, or religious group. Notice, again, gender, sexuality, those kinds of things, which in fact people are pursued for and are murdered for, are not part of this conception of genocide. So, killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The bottom line is what you are attempting to do is, as it says in the preamble, destroy a particular group. So there is intention understood as part of this. So with that definition, let's begin our discussion. I'll start today with the borders of the Ottoman Empire. And the reason that I show these to you is because we have a tendency to forget how large the Ottoman Empire was. It's something that's destroyed in the wake of World War II, World War I, and it never appears again. But at its peak, it is an extremely large empire, and it encompasses sections of North Africa, sections of the Middle East, and sections of Europe. And we have a tendency, I think, to forget that. But the Ottoman Empire goes almost to the borders and the gates of Vienna. So it's actually in Austria when the famous story is that it gets stopped, the empire gets stopped at the gates of Vienna. But it's important to see that extent, because what you have to then understand from looking at this is that the Ottomans and people who lived under the Ottomans, and certainly people who governed the Ottoman Empire, have a sense of their imperial nature. They are a large, multi-ethnic empire, albeit an empire that sits with Muslim rulers at the apex of that empire, but they definitely encompass Christian subjects, they encompass Jewish subjects, they encompass Zoroastrian subjects, I mean, a whole series of subjects, but the majority population in this empire is Muslim. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So keep that in mind as we look at the empire by the time we are talking about the period immediately following World War I, because the empire basically shrinks dramatically, and it's already begun to shrink before we ever hit World War I. By the late 19th century, heading into the early 20th century, you have a series of Balkan wars. This area here where you see my cursor now is the Balkans. So the Ottomans lose Greece already in the 1820s. Greece is considered part of the Balkans. And then they begin to lose these other territories as we head toward 1912 and 1913. They've lost bits and pieces of them, but they lose them whole cloth with these two wars that are fought in the early 20th century. And then additionally, the Ottomans lose territory on this side, first to the Empire of Russia, and later, as the Empire of Russia is replaced by the Soviet Empire, and I think it's safe in many ways to call that an empire too, they again carve out sections of what the Ottoman Empire thought was it. For our focus today, we're going to look principally at Turkey, what we call the Anatolian part of Turkey. And we're going to talk a little bit about historic Armenia going all the way to this red area that is ultimately going to become part of the Soviet Union as the Armenian SSSR. Okay, so Armenians in the later Ottoman Empire, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a population in the empire of roughly 2 to 3 million people, probably closer to 2 million people. Most of the Armenians are in Anatolia, sections of Anatolia, and they also live on the eastern side of the empire, which you saw heading into the Russian borderlands there. About 70% of the Armenian population is poor. They live mostly in the countryside, although there is a privileged group that lives in Constantinople. I put in parentheses renamed Istanbul in 23 because the name goes back and forth until the Republic of Turkey officially readopts the name Istanbul. So for the time we're talking about, it's Constantinople. And in the countryside, the Armenians are subject to the whims of their Turkish and Kurdish neighbors, which does not mean that they always have bad conditions. that they live under, but they are subject to their neighbors because their neighbors are Muslim and the Armenians are Christian. The Armenians are Eastern Rite Christians, some are Protestant Christians because American missionaries and other European missionaries have made tremendous inroads amongst the Armenian populations. And they are also Armenian Catholic, but that is their religion, and they are a minority religion and a minority group within a majority Islamic. And by Islamic, I'm not making any statement about the fervency of the belief of their Muslim neighbors, simply that their neighbors are Muslims and their neighbors do worship differently than they do. What this means is that the Armenians as a minority group, and we'll come back to this in just a moment, are frequently overtaxed, they're robbed, they can be kidnapped, sometimes they're forced to convert to Islam. Particularly in the hinterlands, this does not happen in Constantinople proper. That's very, very rare. Constantinople is a fairly modern, by the late 19th, heading into the early 20th century city. It is the capital, the imperial capital of the empire. So just the way you wouldn't expect those kinds of things to happen in any major capital city, you wouldn't expect those kinds of things to happen in Constantinople. So when I say that the Armenians are Christians, what that means is that under a Muslim majority country, or empire in this case, that recognizes itself as Muslim, and they're not jihadists the way we kind of understand that term today. They're not Muslim fundamentalists. There are Muslim fundamentalist elements. There are clerical jihadists. There are clerical moderates. You have the full gamut of these kinds of organizations religiously in Constantinople and in the Ottoman Empire. However, the one thing that it does mean is that because it considers itself a Muslim empire, the Armenians as Christians are dhimmi. And dhimmi, the DH is pronounced like a TH. Dhimmi mean that they are both a protected group, but in exchange for being protected, they have to pay frequently onerous taxes, and their status is not equal. And this would be the status of all Christians under the Ottomans, not just the Armenians. So Greek Christians, Assyrian Christians, Armenian Christians, other Catholic groups, and indeed Jewish groups who live under the Ottomans would be subject to these types of limitations. So what are these limitations? And again, where it says as Christians, you could put in Jew, or you could even just say non-Muslims. I said Christians because that's what the Armenians are. As Christians, they're not considered equal to Muslims under the law. For example, testimony by Armenians against Muslims is inadmissible in court. As Christians, they're not allowed to carry weapons. Christian houses cannot overlook those of Muslims. Churches cannot be taller than nearby mosques. And significantly for our story, it's not just that churches cannot be taller than nearby mosques, but churches are not allowed to be built in all kinds of outlying areas. So where Armenians already historically have their churches is where Armenians will congregate, which for our story of genocide makes things easier because they're localized. They are around where they worship. That's where they live. All of these rules and regulations stem from something called the Pact of Omar or Umar, which was put into place by one of the early caliphs of the Islamic empires in the 800s. It goes back very, very far. It's not always observed, this dhimmitut status, but for the most part, when it comes to Armenians, and particularly in the 19th and 20th century in the Ottoman Empire, these rules and regulations are observed. So let's talk about the lead up to the Armenian Genocide. And in this case, we have a few items here, and then I'll elaborate in a moment. So first is the loss of territory from the 18th century onward. And think back to your history, European history, world civ that you took in college or in high school, and remember Napoleon making it all the way to Egypt and into Palestine? Well, those are some of the earliest European inroads into Ottoman territory as the European empires begin, or kingdoms begin, to chip away at this large imperial holding that was this Ottoman Empire. And so it begins really with Napoleon, but the British are going to be chipping away, the Russians are going to be chipping away, a whole series of groups are going to be grabbing territory from the Ottomans throughout these 3 centuries, 18th, 19th into the 20th. And what that means is a few things. It means that the Ottomans are going to feel shakier. The Ottomans are going to feel less positively disposed to those within their empire who aren't Muslim, particularly since most of these groups who are chipping away on the outskirts of the empire are Christian in nature. Add to this that the Armenians begin to demand reforms beginning in the mid-19th century as a large, as we said, 2 to 3 million people, minority group within the empire. Now, they are not the only group by any stretch of the imagination who is demanding reforms from what you could call a sclerotic, ossified Ottoman port. That's the Ottoman imperial center. The Ottoman Empire desperately needs to modernize. It fights modernization. It doesn't want to do it. The leadership is corrupt. The leadership is followed in kind of dynastic fashion, and the leadership is not predisposed to accepting these demands for reform. And the demands for reform, as I said, they don't just come from the Armenians. They come from Muslim citizens as well. They come from Jewish citizens. And all of these demands begin to crowd in the latter part of the 19th century into Constantinople, where the seat of the government is. So they're coming in from the hinterlands, from the Vilayet of Syria, from other areas, and they're making demands. And the demands are not being met. Add to this foreign interference, which I'll come back to in just a moment, repressive reactions on the part of Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan, in 1894 to 96, as he starts to feel uncomfortable and basically unsettled on his throne. And then add to this a major internal modern and nationalistic threat, which is the threat posed by the Young Turks and one of their organizations that ultimately can be considered kind of a political party, which is the Committee of Union and Progress, or the CUP, which in 1908 stages a coup against the Ottoman emperor. And the Young Turks, and again, we'll come back to this again, they are not particularly moneyed, but they are a modernizing, professionalizing group of junior military officers who, like many of those who are demanding reform, have had it with the Ottoman Empire and its heel dragging as it refuses to modernize. So let's briefly talk about the rise of Armenian discontent, because it doesn't come from nowhere. And what you have to consider is that there have been Armenians within the Ottoman Empire for centuries. So why in the 1860s and 1870s, all of a sudden are we starting to see discontent? And it's not just discontent, it's demand that things change. And again, what I'm talking about in the Armenian context, you could talk about in the context of other Muslim groups and other Christian groups and even Jewish groups within the empire. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, you have a rise of intellectually and economically successful groups within Armenian society. They are mostly clustered in the larger Constantinople area, and they begin to question their status as second-class citizens, as dhimmi within the empire. They want more rights. And there is no move on the part of the imperial rulers to give them more rights. These groups have support, and this is where foreign interference, what we talked about just a moment ago, comes in. They have support from Great Britain, they have support from Russia, and they have support from France. all of these major imperial powers, and they are empires in their own right, are beginning to pressure the Ottoman Empire to extend equal rights to all their citizens. And more specifically, all three of these groups, so all three empires, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of France, and it's not really a kingdom anymore as we head into the 19th century. You know, we're heading into the time of yet another French Republic, but they have, within that context, they have imperial holdings anyway. They have colonial holdings. All of these groups, when the Ottomans push back, say, fine, if you don't want to respond to us, we will protect Christian rights and Christian interests within the empire. So each time that's their into the empire. And what that means is that any Christian group under this Muslim majority empire is going to be suspect, because these foes of the empire are all claiming to represent the interests of these Christian groups. So it becomes very, very problematic for Armenian subjects within the empire. Fast forward to 1894 to 1896, and you have a series of massacres directed by Abdul Hamid II, thus the Hamidian massacres, and they are directed at Armenians, and they are particularly nasty. You have between 100 and 300,000 Armenians who are murdered by these series of events. And the reason for this is, amongst other things, that between 1877 and 78, there was a war fought between the Empire of Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the Russo-Turkish War. And the Russians claimed to represent Christian interests, and the Russians cleaned the Ottoman clock. That's what happened. Now, with the Treaty of Berlin of 1878, the Ottomans, in fact, didn't do so badly, considering the fact that they had actually lost the war. But in response to pressure from the Russians and from others who represented the Armenian Christian interests and other Christian interests for reform and a say in Ottoman politics, Abdul Hamid, the emperor, made a decision, and his decision was that he was going to outfit a paramilitary group, and they were made up of Kurdish irregulars, and he was going to go after the Armenians, because if you shut the Armenians up, then in theory you shut out these outside imperial forces who are attempting to unsettle his monarchy. As it says here, it earns him the fond nickname of Bloody Sultan, which, oh, and this is a depiction of some of the Hamidian massacres. The one other thing that you see here is we talk about the Armenian Apostolic Church, and also the fact, and this is something that we have a tendency to forget today, that there are U.S. Protestant missionaries heavily involved in missionary work, particularly missionary work to Christian groups within the Ottoman Empire. And amongst other things, they bring in notions of liberty and equality. And these are not notions that fit well with any kind of an imperial setup. So fast forward from the Hamidian massacres of the 1890s to the beginnings of the collapse of empire. And when I say the beginnings of the collapse of empire, in fact, the empire is beginning to collapse, and it's being called the sick man of Europe by the other European powers throughout at least the 19th century. So this is a long time coming. And it's fascinating to watch, because the Europeans both want to claim Ottoman territory, but at the same time, they don't want the Ottoman Empire to collapse, because if it collapses, there's a void. And then what that means is that these imperial forces, whether it be the French or the British or the Russians, will be going after each other to grab territory, as opposed to, again, chipping away at the Ottoman Empire, which is safer for them as far as they're concerned, because they're not fighting each other directly. So as the Ottoman Empire begins to collapse under the weight of these simmering tensions, I guess is the way to say it, in 1908, you have a revolution, the Young Turk Revolution. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II is overthrown by this group of reformers and they are looking to establish a new modern constitutional government. So at first, the Armenians, amongst many other groups, including the Jewish groups, by the way, if you're following Zionist politics from the era, pre-state Israel politics, are all excited by this development. They're hopeful that what this means is that this will no longer be an Islamic state, which means that they, as minority groups within this empire, will have an equal place in the new state. And what they soon learn is that that's not going to happen. The Young Turks are nationalistic, and they want, most of all, to Turkify the empire. And we'll come back in a moment to what that means. But just know that according to this thinking of the Young Turks, non-Turks, especially Christian non-Turks, are viewed as a grave threat to the new state, because the new state has to be Turkish, whatever that means. We'll come back to that. And the new state should not be multi-ethnic or Ottoman, and the new state should be homogeneous. And whenever somebody starts to talk about a homogeneous state, a homogeneous nation, when the nation up until this point has not been one nation, it's been a multi-ethnic, multinational state, hang on, buckle your seatbelts. Let's put it that way, because it's going to get nasty. So Armenians, as I said, living in the empire, hope that the Committee of Union and Progress, which is really it starts out as a secret society, but it's really the political arm of the Young Turks, they hope that this will change the status that they have as second-class citizens. It doesn't happen. In 1913, the Young Turks begin an overt program of Turkification. And by this, what they begin to do is to encourage non-Muslim citizens of Turkey to convert to Islam and become more Turkish. Now, having said that, again, let's be very clear. These are not fundamentalist or Islamicist in the way we kind of understand it today in the 21st century. They just think very strongly that to be Turkish means to be Muslim. It doesn't necessarily, by the way, mean to be of Turkic peoples, because if you become a Muslim, you can join the greater whole. But ultimately, that is going to be a failed call, and we'll explain in just a moment. So obviously, Christians are targeted by this policy. Some of the Christians, the Armenians, the Assyrians, some others in the empire convert. Most of them refuse. Now, keep in mind, the Armenians speak a different language. They have a different historical heritage. They have a different religious heritage. So they really are part of a multi-ethnic group, but they will never be Turks in the way the Young Turks begin to understand this. So in 1914, the Turks enter World War I on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I won't run through how we get there. Hopefully you know, and if you don't, put it in the chat, and we'll take it up later. At the same time, Ottoman religious authorities declared jihad, or holy war, against all Christians except their allies being the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, all of whom are Christian. What this does is it opens the door for military leaders to argue that the Armenians are traitors because they're not Muslims. And even though the Armenians themselves have answered the general mobilization and have been called up into the Turkish imperial forces, they are suspect. There is a question as to their loyalty because there's Christian, and it is becoming clearer to many within this changing imperial setup that to be Christian is not to be a loyal Turk. As the war intensified, Armenians organized volunteer battalions to help the Russian army fight against the Turks in the Caucasus regions. Now, this is a small group of Armenians. We need to be very, very clear. But the very fact that some Armenians were not loyal to the Turks is going to come back when we get to denial as a charge that is leveled, and it's leveled, quite frankly, inaccurately by the successor regime to the Ottomans. So These events and the general Turkish suspicion of the Armenian people leads the Turkish government to begin to push for the removal of Armenians from the war zones along the Eastern Front, so the front in the east with the Russians. Although the decision for the deportation of all Armenians from the western sections of Turkey is not going to be fully implemented until World War I is fully in swing. So what this means is that the Ottomans begin to view the Armenians as fifth columnists, meaning they say they're loyal to the empire, but they are not loyal to the empire. Add to this that in April of 1915, the Allies land in the Dardanelles. So the Christians are at our, the gates of our imperial city, of our capital city. And what happens is that the CUP begins to target the Armenian population, but it targets them in phases from 1915 through 1916, but really through the end of the war at least. So what it does is it targets those who are most likely to resist first. That means it targets the Armenians who were loyal to the Ottoman regime, who have enlisted or have been drafted into the Ottoman Empire imperial forces, and what they do is they disarm them. So the men who are fighting age and trained are disarmed, and then they are sent out into labor battalions that are supervised by the army. And these labor battalions are meant to work these men to death, either to work them to death or to starve them in the context of all of this. So what happens is that the Young Turks and the Union in Progress Party take advantage of the war to cover their genocidal actions. Now, genocide as a concept doesn't exist at this point. The Genocide Convention, which we started with, is brought into legal existence in '48. The term genocide is coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1943. Lemkin actually is watching the genocide against the Jews. Lemkin himself, in addition to being a diplomat, is of Jewish Polish extraction. And so Lemkin coins it watching what's going on with the Jews, but with an eye back to what happened in the Ottoman lands at this time and the Armenians. And he writes very specifically about the fact that he, in thinking about what happened to the Armenians, thinks that that is the first of the modern genocides. So the Young Turk Triumvirate, the three major heads of the Young Turk group, we have Enver Pasha, we have Talat Pasha, and we have Jamal Pasha. And these three together are the ones who issue the orders for the genocide. And they issue written orders, and they also telegraph out orders, which is why if you have been in the museum and seen the installation for the last stage of genocide, the denial stage, which illustrates the Armenian genocide, you will see a scrim of the Syrian desert, which is where many of the Armenians were forced out to starve to death or to die from thirst. And you will also see a telegraph transmitter on the table there, because these orders went out from Talat Pasha in the Ministry of Interior to provincial governors and henchmen. And these three are responsible for the deportation and massacre of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. And they deal as a group with all issues connected to the deportation and extermination of Armenians. The deportation dates according to region, the routes and places, the concentration camps for their penning up so that they can be allowed to starve in these locations. There's more than 20 concentration camps. This is what they do. And it's remarkable. They, at no point while it's happening, deny what they're doing. There is no term for this. Some people call it at the time a crime against humanity. So the Armenians in the army, as I said, are assigned to work in labor brigades in remote areas. They're either executed or they're basically worked to death. In April of 1915, you have a series of massacres in an Armenian town called Van. The Armenians fight back and they wait for the Russians who manage to come over the border in this particular area. So in this particular area, they manage ultimately, some of them, to survive. What really marks the kickoff of the genocide, if I can use the term kickoff in that way, is the murder of 230 to 270 Armenian intellectuals who were very high level and actually were within government circles and very financially well off, who lived in Constantinople. They're rounded up on April 24th, 1915, and first they're tortured, and then ultimately they're murdered. And that really is the beginnings of the floodgates that are going to open up. Mass killings and deportations of Armenians follow around the country. Property is taken by local Turks. None of this property is considered Armenian property. They are told very clearly by government officials, if the Armenians are no longer in this property, it is yours to do with as you see fit. And Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr., so the American ambassador to Turkey, is watching all of this, and he's going back and forth between Turkey and Washington, and he is appalled. He actually has conversations with the three pashas and says, this is mass murder. And they shrug and they say, yeah, that's what this is. They have no problems with this. He then says, he announces to Washington, when the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were giving the death warrant to a whole race. And it is very clear that this is what the pashas intend to do. They consider the Armenians an alien group within their nation modernization program, within their nationalization program, and they're going to get rid of them. And remember that I said that early in this period, they could, in the late 19th and very early 20th centuries, there were times when Armenians were forced to convert to Islam, and the thought was that made things okay because now they fit within the larger nation building apparatus. Well, we know for a fact that there were many converted Armenians who were deported and murdered. So the conversion didn't save them. They were still considered alien to whatever it is that makes somebody Turkish. And again, I can't answer that question. Who knows what that means? What this map is of the various areas where there were battles, where Armenians fought back, and then areas where they were herded into deportation, and then ultimately areas where they were annihilated, like Deir Zor. And what you'll notice is that they're moving them into, the Syrian desert. They move them as far as Mosul and Kirkuk. And the other thing that you need to know, which is very interesting, we think of the Kurds today, and we talk about the Kurds as a group against whom genocide has been waged. It's very interesting that some of the genocideers at this period who were an integral part of the destruction of about 1.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, those were Kurds themselves. They were Kurds. So never forget that you can be both a victim and a perpetrator, because that's something that we as Americans have a real hard time thinking about. So just how the deportations work very quickly. Orders are telegraphed. There are also secret orders given man to man. They're carried out by the police, but they're also carried out under the direction of provincial governors where the Armenians live. Government officials who refuse to follow orders, and some of them do, are immediately sacked. They're fired. No, the pashas want to get this done. There is a deportation committee set up in Constantinople. The reason I highlight that is because it means it comes from the top. This is not something where the periphery may be making decisions and then the center after the fact is saying, yeah, we go along. That is not what's happening here. Deportation notices are given throughout Armenian areas, and the Armenians are told to report to central stations from which they are moved out, sometimes by train, sometimes on foot, really on what we would call today death marches. Armed gangs do much of the killings. We're talking about Kurdish bands. We're talking about criminals. We're also talking about Muslim refugees from the Balkans and Russia, because as a result of the Russo-Turkish War, there was a major population transfer. And there were all kinds of Muslims who were forced out of the Russian Empire and into the Ottoman Empire. And so they want to get back some of their own. And so they're also involved in all of this. This is also pitched as a jihad. As I made clear a few moments ago, this is not a jihad. I want to be very, very clear about that, even though there are some clerics who call it one, but this is really a modern state building project. And now I just wanted to show you photos of some of what happened. And some of these photos were taken by a man named Armin Wegener. And he's a very interesting fellow. Armin Wegener was a German medic who served in the German Imperial Army during World War I, and he happened to be stationed in Turkey with their Turkish allies. And Wegener began taking pictures of the genocide, and particularly of the deportations. He was ordered to stop and he refused. He ultimately was pulled out of Turkey, but much of the incredible close-up, vibrant photography we have of the period was taken by Wegener. Not all of these are Wegener shots, some of them are. This is a picture of the hanging of Armenians within the empire for having been Armenians. These tripods, and you'll see one in the display in our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery. These tripods are the way in which they do hangings in the Ottoman Empire. They don't do the strange crossbar shape that we do. And they will frequently leave bodies up for days as a warning to others as to what potentially is coming. Again, photos of mass forced deportations. They're heading through villages and they're heading out toward the Syrian desert. These are Armenians from Caesarea, which is a town in front of a jail. And you'll notice that there are Armenians who are loyal to the Sultanate. If you look at their head garb, this is standard Ottoman head garb, the fez. They're going to be murdered about an hour after this photo is taken. We need to ask what happens to Armenian women, children, and the elderly. Some children are spared deportation, but when you're spared deportation, you're taken in by a Muslim family. And when you're taken in by a Muslim family, you generally convert. There is no option. There is nothing else you can do. Beyond that, when you're taken in by a Muslim family, there is sexual abuse, rape of women and girls, and I'm not talking about in the families. I'm talking about the fact that as part of the genocide, rape and sexual abuse were a frequently used tool against Armenian women to basically destroy the group. Girls are also married into Muslim families against their will, and the elderly are murdered. And these shouldn't surprise anybody who has studied the Holocaust, because you're going to see the same kind of patterns again. This is a photo of an Armenian mother and her 3 children. This is a photo of Armenians, again, heading into the Syrian desert. Oh, sorry, I already showed you this photo. This entitled, it's from a paper of the time, The Long Line That Leads to Death, Deportation of Christians from Their Homes to the Arid Wastes to Die. Here is a tent city, and this is an Armin Wegner photo. Another tent city, again, Armin Wegner, again, they're very, very close up. These are children in a village starving to death on street side. These Armenian children orphaned in the Syrian desert after deportation. They're not going to survive, unfortunately. Again, this is, they've made it through the Syrian desert. They're almost to Aleppo, which is a town, well, a city in Syria, which you would know today because it was, big sections of it were flattened by the tender mercies of Assad in the current civil war. But this is a mother whose child has either just died or is dying. So the next question should be, what was the international response? And surprisingly, the international response, the reason I say surprisingly is because there was no real precedent for this. The international response was vigorous. And the American response in particular was extremely vigorous. There were committees that were opened up to save the Armenians throughout the United States. $110 million plus were raised in 1915, 16, 17, 18. That's more than $1 billion in today's money. That's a lot of money. American, British, and German governments, in spite of the fact that the war was being fought, prepared reports on the atrocities, and they demanded post-war trials of the leaders. Sorry, I have a typo there. Armenian genocide was actively covered in major American newspapers. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, literally dozens of them, in the New York Times, in the Christian Science Monitor. I mean, this was a major point of coverage, and that was in spite of the fact that we were watching a world war. We weren't engaged in the war yet. We don't get into the war until April of 1917, but this was to us part of what was going on, and it was appalling. And then we had American and German missionaries, because Germans too, and journalists and travelers told of the horrors of the death marches. And in fact, there were even members of the German military who wrote back, and they didn't write back in an admiring fashion for the most part. I want to be very clear about this. So what happens? The Turks lose the war along with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. The result of all of this is that the Ottoman Empire is destroyed at the end of the war as part of the settlements in the post-war period. The Austrian Empire is destroyed. The German Empire is destroyed. Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Hungary, becomes its own separate thing. The Russian Empire is destroyed as well. And you can argue in many ways that it was destroyed by the war, even though it really begins to completely fall apart in 1917. But it's related to what happens during the war as well. The Young Turk leaders flee the country. They are, in fact, courts-martialed by the Turkish Ottomans while they're still sitting in office in 1919. All three pashas are sentenced to death. And they're not caught. They find refuge in Berlin. Operation Nemesis is an operation that was put together by Armenian survivors, and they go after the three pashas and they assassinate two of them in Germany. One of them is assassinated in broad daylight in Germany. The Armenian assassin is brought to trial, and so there's witnesses, I mean, broad daylight. And he is found innocent, just to give you a sense of how people observed this. For our purposes, the Allies got there too late. The Armenians are dead by the time the war is winding down. The survivors are part of what today we call the Armenian diaspora. There's big populations in Canada and the US. There's big populations in the Middle East and in Western Europe. The trials that were supposed to happen after the war on the part of the Allies don't happen because Kemal Ataturk, who heads up the new Republic of Turkey serves as a bulwark against communist revolution as far as the British are concerned. And so one of his requirements is that he will not try anybody, and he will not admit to genocide or to the prior regime having been involved in genocide. And so that is it. Nothing is done as far as that goes. And then denial begins. And to give you a sense of denial, denial occurs during the genocide and it occurs after the genocide. It extends the crime of genocide to future generations of victims because it continues with the intent to destroy the group. To this day, the Turks do not admit to having done anything wrong when it comes to their own Armenian citizens. Denial is done by minimizing the evidence or the numbers, and anybody who knows anything about Holocaust denial, your head should be coming up and going, oh, okay, because it's the same thing. Denial means you had no genocidal intent. You blame natural forces. You blame a civil war between Armenians and Turks. You blame the World War. You blame the victims. They were a disloyal minority. They committed crimes. You deny that the facts on the ground fit the definition of genocide as it is elaborated upon in 1948. You today say that if we accept that this was genocide, we will harm our current interests and it's over and done with, so we're not going to do that. You go on to say that whatever occurred is the fault of a vanished empire. And so again, you're not going to say anything about that. You just won't, you won't mention that. And then what you do is when a Holocaust museum, in this case, it was our Dallas Holocaust Museum and Center across the street, when that museum gets ready to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide in 1915, as the local representative of the Turkish government, thus the Turkish seal, you write and you say that this was not a genocide and you should not be recognizing this, and what is it that you're doing? And you also send a number of books with it to educate us on said genocide. And then you continue to wage this war of denial. You have political cartoons that you use the internet, you accuse Armenians of being murderers, you accuse Armenians of being separatists, you accuse Armenians of having been fifth columnists, all of the things that we've already talked about. And that is really the nature of how all of this works. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see. How do I? Okay, there we go. And I would be happy to take any questions. Okay, there is a question from Don White. Hi, Don, it's good to hear from you. And he says, Sara, could you comment on former director of the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman, refusing to recognize the genocide as such, terming it tantamount to a genocide? I never forgave him for this. Okay. I cannot speak for Mr. White, for Mr. Foxman. I don't know what motivated his saying this. What I can tell you is that we, as the United States government, have never officially recognized the genocide, nor, by the way, has the State of Israel. Both of us, both states, have good or reasonable relations with modern Turkey. In the case of the United States, what we have done is pass 2 congressional resolutions, one from our Senate and one from our House last year, saying that this was a genocide, but without some sort of a presidential nod or approval of that, it will never be officially recognized. And I have one word for you, although there are more words, but that word would be Incirlik. And that is the name of our massive Air Force base that we maintain in Turkish territory, that is our jumping off point into Iraq, into any other area of the Middle East that we need to get into. And we can fly from there, because I have heard people say, well, just fly from Israel. But the problem is that if you leave Israeli territory, if the Israelis would give Americans permission to open up a massive base on Israeli territory and then to fly sorties out of Israeli territory, no Arab regime in their right mind is going to give us permission to cross over their airspace. And so there's another reason for us to be in Incirlik. And the Israelis have their own reasons, and they're also their military and political reasons, the same as ours. And we're not the only regimes who are in this position. I have another question. Can I talk about the US's current acknowledgement or lack thereof of the genocide? I mean, that really is my point in all of this, which is that we're just, for the time being, we're not willing to recognize this because we have strategic interests in Turkey. Now, having said that, Erdogan has also been very clear that if we recognize this as a genocide, he will close down the base and he will no longer let us operate from there. So the question becomes, as a head of state, do you say, you know, heck with it, I'm gonna do what's morally right, and I'm gonna recognize this thing? I can't tell you, you know, how to make that decision. Luckily, it's not my decision. So sitting here as the chief of education at a Holocaust museum, am I appalled by the fact that we don't recognize this genocide? Hell yeah, I'm appalled. Would I see this differently were I, you know, in a major position of authority in the United States? I don't know. I like to think that I would not, but I really can't answer that. One final question is, let's see what we've got. Hold on, I'm sorry. Does denial impact the victim's descendants psychologically? Absolutely, no question in my mind. Your identity is based in the fact that this happened. You are an Armenian, but you cannot live in the Armenian homeland. You cannot live in the seedbeds of Armenian Christianity, where your people for more than a millennia resided, and you can't do this. So if you are continuing to have Armenian identification and Armenian Christian identification, is this what you live and breathe? Yeah, no question. And I would put to you the same way Jews, you know, live and breathe when they were forced out of you know, Zion in the late Roman Empire. Yeah, this becomes an integral part of your identity. Somebody else asked why I decided to study Armenia. Well, first of all, it was really part of denial that we wanted to cover, because it was the most egregious example of denial I've ever seen. And all genocides have denial in them. But this was so totally egregious because up until fairly recently, you had living witnesses of this. And when I say living witnesses, I don't just mean genocide survivors. I mean journalists and missionaries and reporters and military types who all witnessed it. And the Turks doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down and quintupled down. I know, bad analogy, but they just kept saying, no, it didn't happen. It wasn't a genocide. It's really impressive. One final question, and then I'm going to give it back to Annie to sign us off. Ellen Leinoff Ennis wants to know if we can talk about Hitler's study of the Armenian Genocide. I don't know how in-depth of a study Hitler did of the Armenian Genocide. He was most definitely aware of it. As we said, there were German military advisors who were in Armenia during the genocide. And the claim is that Hitler did at one point say, when he was beginning to gear up for the genocide against the Jews, after all, who remembers the Armenians? Whether it's apocryphal or not is not the point. The point is that Germans themselves were willing to believe that he had said that. So again, people were aware of this both in Europe and in the United States. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Annie to wrap up.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for that presentation. I know we could do many, many more hours on that, but we'll start there at least. Thank you everyone again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for more of these history highlight series. Our next one on July 14th will be on legalizing the Holocaust with Dr. Charlotte DeCoster, our Director of Education. And as always, please feel free to visit our website, dhhrm.org, for all of our upcoming programs. Everyone have a great evening. We look forward to seeing you soon.